Hello. In this presentation, we're going to be talking about assessment and formulation in CBT. And specifically in this part, I want to talk about the nature and role of CBT formulation. So we're going to be looking at what a formulation is, what it looks like, what its main functions are, and what's the main focus of this kind of approach. So let's start with that question about what is a case formulation, or what's sometimes called a case conceptualization. Both mean the same thing. Modern CBT is based on an individual understanding of a person's problems. We don't just have a collection of therapeutic strategies that we apply to people willy-nilly, but rather we try and develop an individual understanding and then base our therapeutic strategies on what that individual understanding tells us ought to be helpful for this person. So the CBT formulation aims to summarize that understanding in three main areas. First of all, a description of the current problems in terms of the four systems that we talked about in the last presentation. Secondly, ideas about how these problems may have developed through somebody's background and history, including specifically in CBT terms, what kind of beliefs they might have developed as a result of those experiences. Then last, but by no means least, we have ideas about the maintenance processes that tend to keep the problem going. And in fact, this often tends to be the main focus of a CBT formulation. So let's just have a look at an example formulation to give you an idea of what it looks like. So in this case, we have somebody who has social anxiety, and we start off looking at the factors in their background that might have made them vulnerable to developing a problem. And in this case, we have a couple of factors that seem important. First of all, that this person moved around a lot in their childhood, so never stayed in one place for very long, and therefore had some difficulty in forming peer relationships. And secondly, that they lived in a family that was rather begrudging with affection or praise. As a result of these experiences, they developed beliefs along the lines of people probably aren't going to like me and I'm different to other people, I don't fit in properly. These started to cause problems when they ran into some of the typical problems of adolescence in terms of uncertainties in peer relationships and so on, and also when they had a specific experience when they were asked to read something aloud in class and it all went horribly wrong. They got terribly anxious and completely froze up and everybody was laughing at them. As a result of these experiences, they developed social anxiety with thoughts like, people don't like me, I'm not going to be able to say anything, and also an inner focus. What we mean by that is that people with social anxiety often end up focusing all their attention in on how they themselves feel rather than on what's actually going on with the other person. In terms of behavior, they tended to avoid socializing and particularly avoid looking at anybody. In terms of physiology, they had typical anxiety symptoms of increased heart rate, sweating, and so on. And in terms of emotion, they felt anxious and panicky. We then have some maintenance cycles, and as I said just now, these are often the most important part. First of all, that as a result of all these worries, they avoid social situations, they don't look at people when they're talking to them. It means that they don't get any chance to find out what really happens and what people's spontaneous reactions to them might be, and therefore the social anxiety is maintained as things go round in a self-maintaining circle. And then secondly, the second maintenance process happens when people's anxiety actually results in a disruption of their performance. So in this case, if you're very anxious about social situations, then it can often happen that that anxiety does stop you from being able to carry on a conversation, for example. You may get very hesitant. You may forget what you were trying to say. So the anxiety actually does disrupt the social performance, which, of course, somebody then takes as proving that they were right, they aren't any use at talking to people, and so the anxiety is maintained. And again, we have a self-sustaining cycle. So that's just a very simple example of a formulation, and we'll look more at all of this as we go through this presentation. What's the point of all this? Well, there are several purposes of a formulation. Perhaps most fundamentally, it acts as a bridge between, on the one hand, CBT theory, and on the other hand, the actual specific client who's sitting in front of me in a therapy session. So we have the general CBT theory, which, in common with any scientific theory, tends to be pitched at a very general level. It talks about the characteristic thoughts or behaviors of people with particular problems. On the other hand, we have our specific client with his specific problems. And what the formulation does is help us to tie these two together, to help us bridge the gap between the general theory and the specific person so that we can understand their problems in terms of that general theory. It helps us to move from often feeling quite confused and demoralized, as clients often are when they first come into therapy, to a new understanding, helping things to make sense rather than to be just a rather chaotic and confusing mess. Also important is that it can help people to find a less threatening way to conceptualize what's happening to them. So people often start off with very threatening and or self-critical ideas about what's happening to them. For example, I'm getting these symptoms because there is something terribly physically wrong with me. Or perhaps somebody with obsessional thoughts may think that they're having thoughts about harming people because they are a terrible, evil person. By reformulating these things in terms of a CBT case formulation, we can help to dissolve those threatening attributions and help somebody come up with new ways of understanding the problem, which often involve actually normal processes rather than something uniquely peculiar about them. It therefore begins the process of opening up new ways of thinking about things, which is obviously a central process in CBT. It provides a shared rationale and guide for planning treatment. So essentially, typically treatment goals will involve disrupting whatever the important maintenance processes in the formulation are. And lastly, it can help us in managing or sometimes even predicting problems in therapy. For example, if we have a formulation in which somebody's problems include highly self-critical beliefs, then we can have a fair prediction that they may well have problems with some parts of therapy. For example, if we ask them to do a thought record, somebody who's very self-critical may well have thoughts about doing that, like my spelling's not good enough, or my writing is terrible, or other self-critical thoughts about that. And we can predict those and help them to manage them. One of the characteristics of CBT and of CBT formulations is that we tend to focus a lot on current maintaining processes, more so than we do on the historical development of problems. Let's look at some of the reasons for that. First of all, a fundamental reason is because, in a sense, what's puzzling about a long-standing psychological problem is why hasn't it gone away? We know that many psychological problems, their natural history is to resolve, often without any treatment, over a period of time. So when we have, as we often do with the people who we meet for therapy, when we have a problem that's been going on for quite a long time, one of the fundamental questions is, what is stopping this from resolving? And the answer to that is maintaining processes. Secondly, those maintenance processes are often different to the initial causes, and they often take on a life of their own in such a way that actually the maintenance processes would continue even if the initial cause was completely taken away. It therefore seems more important to focus on the current maintenance than on where it came from in the first place. Another important point is that, of course, if past events are in fact important, they must be occurring through some current process. The past can only be having an important influence on somebody's problems if it's resulting in something happening now in the present. And lastly, it's just usually easier to get evidence about current processes than it is about past events. So let's just use an analogy to try and explain this a bit more. If you come across a raging fire and you decide to tackle it, what would be the first thing that you would do about that? I guess most of us would say we would not usually go and look for the match that started that fire. Rather, what we would want to do is tackle the maintenance processes that are keeping the fire going. We would want to reduce the temperature or deprive the fire of oxygen, or in other ways disrupt the maintenance processes that keep the fire going. In just the same way in CBT, we want to focus on what's keeping the problem going, not primarily on what caused it in the first place. Of course, in both cases, it may make sense later on to go back and look for what caused it. In the case of the fire, it may be sensible to try and find out where the match came from so that we can avoid future fires happening from similar causes in the future. And in the same way with CBT, it may be very useful to go back and look at some of the beliefs, for example, that led to the development of a problem, again, so that we can reduce the person's vulnerability to future problems. It's important, though, to be clear here. Sometimes this gets turned into an exaggerated extreme version where people think that somehow you're not allowed to talk about the past in CBT. It's very important to be clear that there is no ban on talking about or working with the past. It's a matter of emphasis, not some kind of absolute rule that you're not allowed to talk about the past. And indeed, the past may be very important sometimes in different ways. First of all, it usually is an important part of developing the formulation. Clients usually want to understand, where did this problem come from? How did I get to be like this? And clearly, often the roots of that are in the past. Later in therapy, as I just was saying, it may be very helpful to look at past experiences and beliefs in an attempt to avoid future problems. And then lastly, of course, there are some specific problems where the nature of the problem means that inevitably we have to focus quite a bit on the past. Perhaps most obviously this is true in post-traumatic stress disorder, where in some way working with the original trauma is very often an important part of therapy. It may also be true if we're working with the consequences of childhood abuse. And it's also true in so-called schema-focused therapy. This is a newer development of cognitive therapy aimed at dealing with people, particularly who have personality disorders. And in that form of therapy, there's often a lot more working with childhood experience. One other point about the CBT formulation, in order to get the kind of information that we've been talking about, there's a need for a lot of detailed information, particularly about the current pattern of the problems. And it's been our experience in working with people new to this approach that the amount of detail needed often feels quite uncomfortable to people. So it's perhaps important to be prepared for that often you will need to ask more about somebody's current symptoms and experience than may initially feel entirely comfortable. So that's all that I want to say about the nature of formulation. In the next part of this presentation, we're going to be looking at the process of actually doing a CBT assessment with the aim of getting the information necessary to do a formulation.